everyone. We are very excited to have such a large group of participants in this online session about corporate insights on freshwater science-based targets. A very warm welcome and a big thank you to all of you. I am Hara Sefaki. I work as a technical manager in CDP, and I'm also part of the SPTN Freshwater team. And today I am not alone. Next slide, please, Michelle. Great. And if you click again, great. I'm pleased to have here with me almost the entire SPTN Freshwater team. Samantha McCrane, Technical Coordinator in the Science-Based Targets Network. Click. Dave Dilks, Senior Principal in Limnatech. Click once again, Michelle. And Margaret Conover, Water Initiative Lead in General Mills, and Shannon Quinn, Global Water Stewardship Leader in Procter & Gamble. Thank you all for being here. So the purpose of this online session is to give you a hint on the initial corporate science-based targets for nature, on what they will be about ahead of the public release this September. And I will be talking a little bit more about this date towards the end of the session. Provide you with valuable insights and lessons learned from the 3 multinational companies that have tested the initial freshwater science-based targets methods, and give you the opportunity to ask the freshwater team, the Science-Based Targets Network, and the companies any questions that you might have around freshwater science-based targets. Next slide, please. Now, before kicking off today's session, we are curious to know the place or the country that you're joining us from. So if you let us know by responding to the first poll that you can find in this session, that would be great. So is it the country Norway? Is it Canada? Is it Australia? Is it a Greek island? Is it from your house in Mexico or from your workplace in the US? Let us know. And I will be looking that way to see the poll. You have 3 minutes. Amazing. I've just refreshed the page and it says Stockholm, oh my, Serbia, Africa, USA, Peru, United States again, Colorado, South Texas, not Texas. I'm going to refresh again. Oh, France, nice. I'm joining from the UK, Seattle, Montana, amazing. Japan, isn't this very early in the morning? Oh, amazing. Portugal, oh, great. I hope it's not too hot. Washington, DC, great. So I will just give it a minute more. There is a little small, like tiny letters for one, and I cannot see it, cannot read it. Great. Oh, in Stockholm. Great. Amazing. Well, we are super excited to have you all here, and thank you for joining. Michelle, would you like to go to the next slide, please? So in today's session, I will be providing a general overview of science-based targets for nature before handing it over to Samantha to talk us through assess, that's step 1, and prioritize, that's step 2. And I will then be providing an overview of measure, set, and disclose, that's step 3. And note that step 3 includes freshwater science-based targets methods only for now. A discussion with Margot and Shannon about their unique experiences during piloting the initial freshwater science-based targets methods will follow. And we will leave quite some time for a good Q&A towards the end of the session. So if you have any questions during the session that you would like to ask, feel free to post these on the Pathable chat for this session. And we will be wrapping up our session with some key takeaways and a call for action. Next slide, Michelle. So in 2015, companies started setting science-based targets for climate through the Science-Based Targets Initiative, that's SBTI. Science-based climate targets show companies how much and how quickly they need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to prevent the worst effects of climate change. From 2015 till now, 117 financial institutions have committed to set science-based targets for climate. And in addition, 3,019 companies representing more than 1/3 of the global economy have joined SBTI with targets approved or with a net zero commitment. And building from this SBTI momentum and recognizing that climate change and nature loss are deeply interrelated, the Science-Based Targets Network, a network of more than 60 leading global nonprofits and mission-driven organizations, is working to enable companies to set targets for climate and nature. WWF, CDP, the Pacific Institute, UNEP, WRI, IUCN, the Nature Conservancy, and many more have joined forces to develop the methods and resources that will drive companies to adopt science-based targets for their impact on all of Earth's natural systems. And we are again not alone. An international team of scientists led by distinguished professors like Johan Rockström are in full support and feed into this effort. So now the network's goal is for the world's major companies to have adopted science-based targets for nature by 2025. And it is inspiring to see that companies are waiting for this. Currently, there are over 115 companies from more than 30 countries representing a $4 trillion market cap that are preparing to set science-based targets for nature. Next slide, please. So the targets which will be set by the companies using our methods, guidance, and tools will need to address the pressures like land conversion, like water pollution, and the drivers like the fragmented environmental management systems, which are fueling the loss of nature. That is, changes in the state of nature, like the decline of nature's contribution to people, species extinctions, biomass depletion. So this framework may at first be complex, so can be complex at the first glance, but it is imperative to understand that if we want to change the current trajectory we are on and think about biodiversity loss in free fall, think about the climate change moving towards worst case scenarios, we need to address all these key pressures fueling nature loss, as well as the system level drivers underpin corporate practices. And next slide, please. So science-based targets are measurable, actionable, and time-bound objectives informed by the best available science. Science-based targets for nature give companies a clear pathway to competitiveness and resilience by using science to define their role in protecting and restoring nature. Reversing nature loss in line with science will create a future of resilient businesses and sustainable economies. Next slide, please. So science-based targets for nature focus on preserving freshwater resources and water security, preserving and regenerating land systems, securing healthy, diverse oceans, and supporting biodiversity. We need to do this alongside stabilizing the climate in line with what science defines as Earth's limits and on a socially equitable basis. Next slide. So now, how to set a science-based target for nature? There are 5 steps, and these are presented in this slide. So from left to right, in step 1, the company gathers existing data to estimate its value chain-wide impacts and dependencies on nature. Step 2 focuses on the prioritization of key issue areas and locations for taking action. The company considers actions across its different spheres of influence, from its direct operations to the landscape surrounding its value chain. In step 3, the company starts collecting baseline data for the prioritized issue areas and locations to define what indicators will be used for target setting, to determine the desired condition for these indicators, to evaluate the required degree of response, to define other contributors in the extent of their contribution, and to allocate responsibility. In step 4, the company utilizes the SBTN's action framework and best practice for implementation to develop grounded plans to deliver on its targets. The last step, step 5, focuses on monitoring the company's progress towards the targets that they've set and reporting publicly on this progress. So now I will hand it over to Samantha to talk about the first 2 steps, assess and prioritize of this 5-step process.
Thanks,
Samantha,
Hara. Thank you, Hara. And hi, everyone. I'm Samantha McCrane. I'm our technical coordinator at the Science Based Targets Network. One thing I want to mention, which I think Hara might have covered quickly, is we're focusing on steps 1, 2, and 3 today, because we will have draft methods on each of these methods out for consultation in September. And so these are the methods that we've been working on really closely with our technical teams over the past couple of years. And these are really what we're focusing on today to give you all a preview of what's coming and will be available for public review. So as Hara just sort of went over, in 2020, we introduced a 5-step process to setting science-based targets for nature. And steps 1 and 2 are the sort of essential precursors to corporate readiness for target setting, which really kicks off in step 3. By the end of step 2, companies should know exactly where in the world they need to set targets and take action. And step 3 builds on that to help provide companies with the technical methods for calculating targets that are appropriate to each location selected, and then moving towards an action strategy. So for step 1, I think we can start clicking through the additional slides. Thank you. So step 1 kind of follows similar logic to corporate strategic planning that already exists. And as the first step of target setting, it involves assessing material issues. What are the issue areas that companies need to be addressing with targets? This is important for all companies to pass through first, because all companies impact nature in different ways, depending on the different types of products that they produce and the different places where they're sourcing inputs and operating within their direct operations. In our method for setting SBTs for nature, we have companies first assess their impacts on nature based on what we call the key pressures. And this was depicted in the slide Hara just went over. And the key pressures that we have companies focus on are those that are driving the loss of nature, as proven in the scientific literature. And examples of the pressures that we focus on are those related to ecosystem conversion and use, or land use change, freshwater ecosystem use change, marine ecosystem use change, as well as resource exploitation, including water, as well as other biotic resources and abiotic resources, climate change, pollution, and then also direct biological disturbances like the introduction of invasive alien species. Those 5 categories together are the key pressures which have been proven to be driving the loss of nature, and those are what we ask companies to focus on in step 1 as they assess what's most likely to be material to them and require targets. So once companies have assessed which issues are most material for them, and this is covered in that first point on the slide in terms of the questions answered, we then have companies pass through a more in-depth footprint assessment, which is ideally done quite rapidly, in order to understand which parts of their business, in terms of activities like farming or production or mining and distribution, are most likely to be contributing towards key pressures and require target setting. And so again, footprinting is already a quite common practice for most companies, but in our methods, we build on this and require a bit of a more comprehensive scope of assessment and are a bit more prescriptive about which indicators we want companies to be using so that they have the right information to pass through the different steps and be ready to use step 3 methods. During the pressure assessment, we also have a particular approach which requires that companies know where their activities causing these pressures are occurring. This is already implicit in a lot of the footprinting approaches that are out there, but it's really quite significant for our methods, as we do need to have that location information because the state of nature does vary from place to place. In order to gain this information, companies can either use location data that they have on hand, or they can model estimates based on a lot of different common practices that are already out there. And so finally, once companies have already gathered this information on pressures and done that quick screening across which of these are most likely to be material, they will also look at where, for each of the locations where these pressures are occurring, what is the state of nature in this location? And so using spatial tools like water risk filter or aqueduct, in the case of water pressures, to understand what is the relative water availability or water pollution load in those locations, so that they have a better understanding of the health of the ecosystems in which they're operating. And this is really important information for the companies to gather in step 1 in order to pass into step 2 and be able to prioritize where to get started based on an understanding of both the magnitude of pressures occurring there as well as the health of nature. So we bring both of those pieces together in step 2. If you could pass to the next slide, please. And so, sorry, I talked over a lot of other points here, but this sort of summarizes the 2 parts of step 1. It's that screening for material issues and then the value chain assessment. No worries about going backwards. Thank you. So for step 2, can move there. And you can go to the next slide. So coming out of step 1 and after having done a general footprinting assessment and a general pressure assessment, companies will likely have information on a lot of different locations and a lot of different pressures, and won't necessarily be able to address all of those impacts at once. So in step 2, we introduce a sort of structured process for prioritizing where to set targets first. And the method that we use in this step focuses on rules about which locations are the most sort of stressed from an environmental perspective in terms of water use or water availability. If we're talking about water targets and trying to understand the relative importance of a water target, and also taking a lens towards different aspects of biodiversity like species extinction risk. Just checking which other points to cover here. So by the end of step 2, companies should have a short list of the different locations which they need to set targets for. And this is based on that screening for where the pressures are most severe, as well as where the state of nature is most stressed. An additional step is built in here where companies are able to look at that long list of locations that's generated in the steps and look at which of these locations are the most feasible for the company to get started with target setting based on factors like data availability, on the degree of influence and control over those sites, and other factors that are important for a business in order to ensure that we're really driving towards action in the places that need it most and where companies have the greatest ability to take action and make a positive change. So if you go to the next slide, I believe that summarizes the process, and that is it. So by the end of step 2, companies should know where they're going to be applying their step 3 methods. Those step 3 methods are going to include the methods for freshwater that Hara and her team had been developing, as well as additional methods to set targets on issues like land use change and other issues specific to biodiversity. So I'll pass it back to you, Hara. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam, for this overview of steps 1 and 2. I'm now going to zoom into one of the issues addressed by Science-Based Targets for Nature, and that's freshwater. So as Sam just mentioned, it is in steps 1 and step 2 where companies determine what aspects of nature are material to them that they should then be setting targets for. And if through step 1 and step 2, freshwater is deemed material, they will be guided to set freshwater science-based targets under step 3, following specific methods. And this is what I will go, like in the following slides, what I will be talking about. Next slide, please. So the aspects covered in this version of freshwater science-based targets methods that's intended for the public consultation are the surface water flows and groundwater levels, if local models and thresholds exist, nutrient pollution, and the upstream parts of the value chain and direct operations. What is not covered in this version, but will be considered in future iterations, is groundwater levels, global, I'm talking about the global models, toxic chemicals and other water quality parameters, downstream parts of the value chain of a company, freshwater biodiversity and ecosystems, and the consideration of forward-looking scenarios, including how future climate change will impact water availability and water quality. Next slide, please. So there are 4 components to set freshwater science-based targets. In the first step, the company is required to identify and consult with relevant local stakeholders in order to select the most appropriate modeling approach. For example, if local models and locally based thresholds are available, companies must use these for their target setting process. In the second step, a company is required to calculate its baseline values on relevant pressures. So taking water quantity as an example here, the aggregation of total water withdrawals from all companies' activities within a specified level, basin level, and a specified period of time is recorded as the company's water quantity baseline value in this basin. And the company must define its water quantity baseline value for each basin in which priority sites have been identified. In the third step, the company is required to calculate the maximum allowable level of basin-wide withdrawals well, basin-wide pressure, and this is the maximum volume of water water withdrawn. If we take the example of the water quantity again, from all water uses in a given basin that will not compromise the desired state of nature. And again, as in the second step, the company must define the maximum allowable level of basin-wide pressure for each basin in which priority sites have been identified. Now, the fourth step is where the company defines the target level for its pressures. So determining and allocating a portion of the maximum allowable level of basin-wide pressure to a company's operations is a critical element of this step, as it defines the corporate target level and the level of action. So why is this? This is because it directly aligns with how much a company's pressures must be reduced to meet this portion. Determination of the allocation portion requires a decision on how the maximum allowable level of basin-wide pressure is allocated among water users in the basin. And for this version, the equal contraction of effort is selected. This approach to allocation is currently the only one that is implementable due to technical limitations and data gaps. However, SPTN is aware of the shortcomings of this approach, and in particular, the potential for perverse incentives and entrenching economic inequalities that may arise from it. And they are busy identifying and working on alternative allocation approaches that can be implemented in a practical manner in the final version of these methodologies. Next slide, please. Great, thank you, Michelle. So the results are targets that keep water withdrawals or pollutant loads consistent with the maximum allowable level of basin-wide withdrawal or nutrient load. The targets should be in the format presented in this slide, and companies have the option to use annual time periods as outlined in the first target format, or finer time periods like months as we see in the second example. And the decision on which time period to use depends on the sector. For example, agricultural irrigation withdrawals vary widely on a seasonal basis, and therefore may be better suited to monthly targets than other types of operations where withdrawals are relatively constant over the course of the year. Next slide, please. Now, to help companies follow these steps, recognizing that the level of resources required to define scientifically rigorous and site-specific freshwater targets can be challenging and can be time-consuming, the SPTN developed two approaches. The first one is the locally developed modeling approach, and the second one is the globally developed modeling approach. For the locally developed modeling approach, the company would use locally based thresholds and the method for relating pressures to those thresholds. Example, it can be a hydrologic model, which are recognized by the authorized basin authority for the given basin, and that's very important. For the globally developed modeling approach, this provides an option when local recognized thresholds do not exist currently. Through this approach, target will be based on global models and paired with thresholds that are either globally defined or based on results of global models. This option, although easier to apply, is less rigorous than the locally developed modeling approach, so the results could be less precise. Therefore, the method requires that companies provide proof that local models and locally based thresholds do not exist before they are allowed to use globally developed models and thresholds. And in recognition of this, the Science-Based Targets Network is considering developing local models and thresholds for a subset of basins worldwide where there is a high level of corporate engagement to support the choice of the locally developed modeling approach. So the locally developed modeling approach is the preferred option here. If models or thresholds do not exist and are not being developed by SPTN, companies must follow a globally developed modeling approach. Companies taking this approach can refine their targets in future years with additional stakeholder engagement and application of local models and thresholds where they're made available. Next slide, please. Thank you, Michelle. So that brings me to the pilot perspectives section. Next slide, please, Michelle. So just providing a little bit of a background before I start the discussion with Margaret and Shannon. So 16 companies from different sectors expressed an interest to test the initial freshwater science-based targets methods and be part of the piloting phase. A selection process followed where certain criteria were applied and General Mills, P&G, and Sandori were picked. However, a number of companies that were not selected, they still wanted to be part of this process, and they were as they piloted the methods on their own. And with that, I would like to bring in our two speakers, Margaret and Shannon, and kick off our discussion about their experiences piloting the methods and their key lessons learned. If you go to the next slide, Michelle. Great. So I would like to kick off this discussion by asking you, Margaret and Shannon, from a corporate perspective, why target setting is so important? And I cannot see you, but Margaret, you can start first.
Sure, thank you, Farah, and it's so great to hear the reflections on the design of this process. We had a really insightful time learning about our own water and how to measure and think about it through going through this pilot. So why does General Mills care about water? It seems pretty obvious to say, but all life on Earth depends on water. And that includes the plants and animals that live on the farms where we source our ingredients. Also, water risk is the primary way that climate change impacts General Mills. So that could be too much water, like we saw in 2019 with the Red River Valley flood and freeze that caused the sugar beet crop to fail, or too little, like we saw last year in the severe to exceptional drought in North America. So with target setting, prioritization really helps us focus where we should be working and understand what scale we need to operate at. And through this process, setting illustrative targets helped us to get interesting insights about how doable addressing our footprint might be, and start thinking about when and how we can address it. And it also really affirmed how we need to continue working in coalitions, because we need all water users to be advancing this common vision of a healthy watershed in order to achieve that for us and for all users.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Margaret, for providing these insights. Shannon, would you like, well, is your case similar to Margaret's? And yeah, I'm just asking the same question, why the target setting is so important to you, to your company.
Yeah, hopefully now everyone can hear me. It's connected to my headset. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Thanks for having me join the discussion. And we had a very interesting and insightful as well experience with going through and piloting, and hopefully mutually beneficial on both sides. I just to introduce P&G and kind of why we care about water as well. We are a consumer products company. We sell in over 180 countries around the world, and our brands are in millions of homes around the world. We actually touch 5 billion lives every single day. And besides being in all of those different homes and being staples for many people, another thing our brands have in common is water. 100% of our operations need water to operate and to make product, and about 70% of our products need water to be used. And so water has been a staple and a focus area within our sustainability goals for years, and will continue to be. And really for us, the target setting is important to have to drive the action and drive the right kinds of actions in the right places. So prioritizing, allowing us to understand where we should work first. Having such a large portfolio and being in so many markets is really important. And then having a single metric or a few different metrics that we can track and know if we're making progress. And then importantly, communicate that internally in a simple way to help drive the resources needed to actually have the actions happen on the ground. And then communicate that in a simple way externally outside of the company, so people know that we're moving in the right directions against our targets. And so really at the heart of it, target setting is leads to, or should lead to, the actions that are needed in the prioritized areas.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shannon. And these are really good points that you're making. If we move on to our next slide, please, Michelle. So yes, Shannon, now that I can see you, I was wondering, was it challenging to collect data for steps 1 and step 2? Did you have the data required to start with these steps already?
Yeah, so the short of it is yes, it was challenging. Just to be transparent, it's where we spent the majority of the time during the pilot, is really trying to find the data in the way that it was asked for. And it was really an iterative process and going back and forth and talking about, okay, inside of a company, this is the format that the data is in, or what is possible versus how it was being asked by the members of SBTN as we were kind of going through that pilot phase. And so I think another, besides just in general, like looking at the data, translating the way that it was asked for versus how it appears or how it's organized within the company, but also the defining boundaries or trying to fit ourselves into the boxes of business activities. For example, our company produces many different kinds of products, from baby diapers to shampoos to paper products to like razors. And so there are just so many different products. It was kind of challenging to fit ourselves into the boxes of those definitions for the different boundaries and the different business activities. So that took a while just to kind of discuss that and figure out what the best ones were to start with and where we fit, as well as what data was available now, what could we pull in the time that the pilot was running. So definitely challenging, but we talked through it, and I think it was to the benefit of how the information the pilot was able to provide for this next phase of the recommended guidance.
Amazing. Thank you for providing this answer. And yeah, I'm always quite interested to understand like how easy or difficult it is for companies to collect this data that we are requesting from them. Then Margot, what about data availability in General Mills?
Well, we had an easier time with figuring out what categories we were in because General Mills makes food, so human food and pet food. So it was fairly straightforward to figure that out. And then we had some insights from previous water work that helped us understand that about 85% of our water impact comes from agriculture, so ingredient sourcing, like I was mentioning earlier, and about 14% from packaging, most of which is related to forestry for fiber packaging. So only 1% left is coming from manufacturing. That was the easiest to figure out because we measure water in our plants, so we knew what we were in for that area of impact. And then the aspects that did end up being a little more challenging were to figure out what basins we were locating in for all of our ingredient sourcing, and then which water factors to apply to all of that agricultural activity. Some parts of it were very straightforward because we have tier 1 supplier location data and volume for most of what we buy. And then by working closely with our buyers and with the suppliers themselves, in most cases, we can get pretty close, good insight to agricultural origin, even if we don't have direct line of sight from tier 1 all the way down to the farm level. But that was harder in some commodities and countries than others. For example, we ended up picking California and Madhya Pradesh, India as places to focus on based on that risk assessment. And California was a super data rich environment for us where we could have county level supplier volume data for all of our priority ingredients. Whereas in India, we kind of had to back calculate based on spend and do some guessing based on common wheat producing regions in that country, which is the main thing that we buy there. So it was kind of an interesting exercise in how to make good assumptions and where we could also use this project as an exercise for helping to get better data from our suppliers and help to educate our buyers about why attending to water is an important way to manage risk.
Great, thank you, Margaret. And I think with your answer, you also covered part of my next question, which is which is around upstream activities and sourcing locations. And I was what I was trying and I was hoping to get, and I got it, is how well you know your upstream part of your value chain and suppliers. So you talked about a really good visibility of your tier 1 suppliers, and whether it was challenging to identify and locate your suppliers for the purposes of testing these methods. So if you don't have anything more to add, I can.
I think one thing I would add is that we have pretty good visibility, particularly in some high risk commodities through multiple tiers of the supply chain. But like almost every company, we could keep doing better with that. There's always opportunity to get more transparency in the supply chain and to continue working with suppliers in order to help them give us good information and to partner on why data is useful rather than burdensome for everyone. So I guess that's the one thing I would add.
Thank you, Margaret. And Shannon, was this the same case for you?
So, I mean, I think this was the intention from the beginning to have many different types of industries involved. And for our company, we've thousands and thousands of suppliers supplying many, many different types of materials, ingredients, packaging, even services. And so this was a very challenging part. In part, mostly because we found that the location of our tier 1 supplier facilities that are actually supplying us with those materials are often confidential, or we're not able to trace those very easily to identify across our thousands of suppliers where the actual locations are, and then even from there, what is this, how are they using water? Are they using water? How much is used and consumed? And so that was definitely a challenging part. In order to kind of solve for that issue through the pilot, we chose a very specific supply chain in a specific product that we had really great visibility to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. And so we were able to use that to kind of see, okay, in a perfect world with this data available, we could do, how would it work? But I think that I don't want to speak for other companies necessarily, but for us, it will continue to be challenging for a bit to get that location specific information. But I do see it changing and more technology being trying to use to track this type of information, even from third-party sources. So hopefully in the future, this will not be as challenging, but I definitely think there was a recommendation to kind of have a glide path, an entry point where we can start with the best available information we have, continue to work to get more, but recognize the limitations that we have in this type of knowledge right now.
Amazing. That's some great points, and it's really encouraging to see, like, to hear from you that there are technologies, and you are that you anticipate that in the future this will be easier, like the tracking, the visibility of the supply chain. Thank you both. Now, if Michelle, you can go to the next slide, please. I would like to move us on a very interesting topic, and that's stakeholder engagement. And I would like to ask you both to briefly talk about your experience with engagement. So how difficult was it to identify your relevant stakeholders? How long did it take? How responsive they were? And whether they were willing to share data with you and help you, or you've encountered difficulties with this. Shannon, do you want to go first?
Sure. So part of of Procter & Gamble's holistic water strategy focuses on reducing water in our manufacturing facilities. And as part of that, we also go a level deeper and look at those facilities that are located in high water stressed areas. And those facilities develop water action plans, utilizing the first 2 steps of the Alliance for Water Stewardship standard in order to come up with those water stewardship action plans. And so for the purposes of the pilot, what we did was we utilized some of that work that had been done going through the first 2 steps of the AWS standard in order to expedite the pilot experience a little bit. So for us, engaging with the stakeholders in the 2 basins that we selected for downstream and for our direct operations was relatively easy because we had done the work already in identifying the key stakeholders, key data sources, etc. But we did that because we knew that if we wanted to start from scratch in a new basin, that it would take quite some time in order to establish that kind of information. Just on average, for us to go through the AWS process, it's about 12 weeks, and we spend a good portion of that time with the identification of stakeholders and engaging stakeholders. Once we did engage the stakeholders, because we had already kind of built that relationship over time and had identified them, we were able to get the responses that we would need. However, the challenge was kind of explaining what we were doing. And so that took a little bit of time to help them understand, why we were asking for this information, what were we going to do with it, and so in the future, I think having more visibility and understanding of what science-based targets are will be really helpful in facilitating those conversations and helping them feel more comfortable with sharing the information.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, that's a great answer. Thanks for sharing this. Margaret?
We had sort of a similar experience. So with India, because that was a new place for us to start thinking about local engagement, we started trying to do stakeholder mapping, but realized how time consuming it was going to be. And given the constraints as the project was quickly coming to a close, we decided to mainly focus on California where it came to stakeholder engagement. General Mills has had a watershed prioritization set of watersheds since 2016, and California has been on that list since we started. It's a really high priority sourcing region for us because we get about 50 ingredients from there, and ones like almonds we can't really source from anywhere else in a cost-effective way. So we had already done quite a bit of deep engagement in that region through some coalitions that we participate in there, like the California Water Action Collaborative, through supplier engagement, working with academics and with regulators. So in a way, we'd already been doing that stakeholder engagement for many years. And because of that, we knew that the groundwater sustainability agencies there were the arbiters of local water plans and targets under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act legislation. So California was comparatively easy as far as the project was concerned, but if we think about it in terms of when we started the stakeholder engagement, it's literally been a years-long process to develop those relationships. But as a result, it was easy to get access to that info for California. And again, a good example of how we were able to operate in a data-rich environment as opposed to India, which was for us a bit more of a data-poor environment.
Great, thank you both for your insightful answers to this. And I will move us quickly to my last questions that will be about lessons learned and next steps. So Shannon, do you have any experiences or lessons learned from the piloting phase that you would like to share with other companies?
I think this maybe will be no surprise to anyone, but the process kind of confirmed that this is a very complex topic, and kind of confirmed why these targets haven't existed or the methodologies hasn't existed until this point. The want and need to have hyperlocal data, but knowing and realizing and having it confirmed that it's usually not available. And so I think having those two options and two different pathways for now until those data sets hopefully someday become more available is definitely an elegant solution to kind of like just the now obvious challenge. I think also just this need to strike a balance between the level and the amount of information that you have and collect versus like getting to action. So making sure that we can strike that balance. And that was kind of the discussion throughout the experience that I had with the pilot was really, okay, we want to get this information. Let's try to be pragmatic, also ambitious, but at the same time, knowing that at the end, what we're trying to get to is real action on the ground. And then the last thing is that, there were points in this experience where I'm like, I don't know if this is going to work, and getting frustrated, but that's how we really knew that things were becoming clearer. Certain aspects were becoming clear and a process was starting to form. And so I do think that that the process itself is working and is continuing to work, and there'll be iterations along the way, but it is moving us towards that goal of creating targets that lead to action. And so I think that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, this is what we want, right? Thank you, Shannon. And Margaret, I know General Mills got to illustrative target setting in 2 watersheds. So what did you learn from the process, and what do you plan to do next?
Well, I really felt what Shannon was saying about the level of complexity. That was definitely something that we also experienced. But I think when we did get to an actual number, which was kind of an exciting and surprising moment along the project, the two folks, myself and one of our agronomists that were participating from General Mills side in the pilot, were actually surprised by how comparatively small and manageable that target seemed after all of the complexity we went through to get there. That was our take. On the other hand, some other folks within General Mills, when we started sharing this more broadly, were still very intimidated by the idea of setting a target for something that's outside of our control, which our agricultural value chain would be. So it revealed to us in a lot of ways that we need to continue doing more internal stakeholder engagement and really helping folks understand how important water is for our business, as well as where we have potential for positive impact, which is what our takeaway as project participants was on these couple of watersheds. But the good news is that it also, I think, gave us some direct confidence and directionality of what we've already been working on, particularly in California. For example, the preliminary modeling we got from some of our regenerative agriculture projects looked like it was aligning with the target that we were getting for this basin in California. Like we would be able to potentially move the needle on, if not completely hit this illustrative target through regenerative agriculture as our primary intervention, since it can have positive water outcomes and in addition to the positive soil and climate outcomes that it's been more widely touted for in the past. So that was very exciting. And then our immediate next step is that even though the science-based target methodology is still being finalized, we really felt like the tools that steps 1 and 2 offered were very strong. And we are now working with WWF as we're up for our every 3-year watershed prioritization refresh. So we're going to be utilizing some of those tools to help us, again, gain focus and figure out where we want to place our efforts and try to right size some of those actions. So it's been very insightful, and it's cool to come out with it with some really practical tools and actions that we can take as a result of being in this pilot.
Amazing. Thank you so much both for your really great, insightful answers. I really enjoyed our short discussion. And now if you can move to the next slide. Michelle, so Suntory would really like to join us here today, but as it is a Japanese company and considering how early in the morning it is now in Japan, Harumichi Seta made a video recording to share some of Suntory's experience from piloting these initial freshwater science-based targets methods. So if you can click the list.
Hello to everyone attending the webinar. My name is Harumichi Seta from Suntory Holdings, Japan. I'm responsible for promoting the global agenda of water sustainability of Suntory Group. We participated in the SBTW pilot study to combine our initiatives with the SBT's methodology to further accelerate our effort toward our 2050 vision to be net water positive. I'd like to share our pilot experience according to each item from the next slide. To proceed with the SBT methodology, step 1 and 2 require collecting location and water use data for all sites in the company's value chain. This pilot required collecting site-specific data for 2 value chains, direct operations and upstream. For the direct operations side, Suntory had already established a system to collect water withdrawal, consumption, wastewater discharge, and water effluent quality data globally before participating in this pilot. We worked on step 2 based on this data and the latitude and longitude data. On the other hand, we do not currently have the in-house capability to collect the latitude and longitude data on agricultural growing regions origin. Our location information on the source of farmland is at the national name, nor do we have the ability to collect our data on water use on each farm. This is about so-called large-scale irrigated agriculture or small-scale rainfed agriculture, etc. In-house, we estimate water use using a water footprint coefficient based on information on parts volume country-by-country basis and conduct impact assessments for each raw ingredient item. We joined SEDEX in 2019, utilized self-assessment questionnaires for over 650 primary suppliers to start collecting data on focus areas: labor, health and safety, environment, and business ethics. However, there are limitations to understanding the detailed water situation at the watershed level. Therefore, in step 3, we approached our primary supplier, a Japanese trading company, to attempt to obtain information from ANECAFE, the Guatemala National Coffee Association, on water issues and water use in the basin regarding the primary coffee producing regions in Guatemala. We believe this process would not have been possible without the cooperation of TNC Guatemala with its local realities and water expertise. Local suppliers do not necessarily have expertise in water, and our perceptions of water issues do not match local perceptions. Based on this experience, we believe it is essential to collaborate with local experts who know water issues to set targets for each local. For the site of the direct operation in this pilot, we focus on the Toledo plant, Spain. Santre had already started preliminary research on the water catchment area of the Toledo plant before starting this pilot. We contacted stakeholders such as government authorities, water utility companies, and university experts through our local NGO. This process took 3 months. Santre is considering an approach to increase water availability for water withdrawal in conjunction with water conservation activities in watershed, and also water saving activity at plant to reduce the impact of water use. Santre has shared this concept with local stakeholders and received strong endorsement from them in this pilot. We are using a simulation model to conduct an initial study of the impact on water quantity and quality in the reservoirs. They are the water sources. However, we lacked the data necessary to calibrate the model and needed to obtain our observation data. Santre is now beginning to work with local university experts to acquire the necessary observation data. While the water risk assessment is the global tool in step 2 is a beneficial method to prioritize, the global model used in the tool is not calibrated by local data and not necessarily reflect the reality of local water risk. For example, in this step 3, we conducted a study in Guatemala and could not find a clear causal relationship between coffee cultivation and the local water challenge. Companies need to strengthen their self-verification process in this regard. Specifically for priority site, we believe it is necessary to enhance the ability to analyze reports and data published regarding local water resources and to strengthen the ability to find and collaborate with experts in each area. To this end, building partnerships with local suppliers through primary suppliers will also be in demand. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
That was interesting to hear. Thank you, Harumichi Seta, for recording this. And if we move to the next slide, Michelle, please. Yeah, it's the time for another poll. So we would be interested to hear from you on how familiar you are with science-based targets for nature. So from 1 to 5, with 1 meaning that you're not at all familiar with SBTN, this is the first time you're hearing about them, and with 5 meaning that you're really a passionate follower of SBTN, and we would be really thrilled about it. So it is the same procedure as before. Simply just respond to the poll provided in this session's webpage. And you have, yeah, let's say one minute to do so. Oh, great, amazing. Great to see that most of you have a good understanding, like a good basis at least of science-based targets, but yeah, really, really interesting answers. That's great. Okay, so most of the, like, if I can base my conclusion to what I see from the graph, most of the people have an understanding, even if it's like a relatively simple for now one, of science-based targets. You've heard of them, which is good. So if I now move to the next slide, can we move to the next slide, please? Michelle, thank you. So this is the moment that you are all waiting for, the Q&A. I would like to open the floor to questions that our participants may have. I know there are a couple, but Alan, since you've been monitoring the chat, could you please give us an update on whether we have any questions from the audience at all? Or we can wait a couple of minutes for this.
Yeah, let's give the audience an opportunity to type in their questions. It doesn't look like we have any at the moment, at least that I can see.
That's okay. Thank you, Alan. I know Sam has a question. Sam, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, I can pose it while we wait to see if other folks have questions. So Shannon and Margot, this was a follow-up on what you both were covering earlier. I just wanted to know if there was anything that you had done prior to trying to engage with the SBT setting process, which made this a bit easier for you. I know both of you touched on some things like the engagement with the Alliance for Water Stewardship, but I'm wondering if you could just highlight any examples of previous work that you'd done which made this journey easier for you. Because this is something that we try to build into our guidance, and I think it'd be helpful for the audience also to get an idea of, what are the building blocks that are already there that folks can look to use as they engage in this. Shannon, if you want to start first, that'd be great.
Sure. So we've been going through kind of our risk assessment journey and different target setting process really since 2015, 2016. Starting kind of historically with more efficiency-based targets for our facilities, and now having recently announced in this past June 2 new water targets that are really based on total water being consumed at our facilities in 18 priority basins, and the water that our consumers, those people who buy our products, are actually consuming when they use our products in the Mexico City metropolitan area and the Los Angeles metropolitan area. So we've been working a lot. We've had a partnership with the World Resources Institute for about a decade now, and we've been working together, utilizing their expertise and the experience that we've had within a company in order to work towards the new targets that we just released. But interestingly enough, it was a bit serendipitous how this pilot actually lined up with the final sprint, really like a year and a half leading up to our new water targets that we just released. So a lot of the experience and knowledge from science-based targets and from the pilot was also infused into how we moved forward with those targets. Really wanting to make sure that we could release targets and get to action faster and incorporate as much as we could of the knowledge from this process and from the pilot. So utilizing tools in the past in order to prioritize, like the aqueduct mapping tool, and through WRI, we'd also had experience with the WWF water risk filter. And so utilizing some of those outside tools to help us first prioritize. And then we did work with the World Resources Institute and gathered some of the information as we went through the pilot process in order to influence what those final targets were. And those final targets are based on where we see two of our largest water quantity impact areas, which is consumer use. And so that's in the downstream, actually. And with WRI, we will be releasing a methodology in how we estimated the total water associated with product use in our priority basins around the world. And so that information and that methodology was influenced by this pilot and will hopefully also help to provide a method or a guide for those who have very large downstream impacts, like consumer products companies or others who provide services that need water in the downstream phase of the value chain, to also develop targets alongside of the SBT methodologies. So yes, lots had been done before, and I think Margot mentioned this in one of her previous contacts or previous comments, but it was also kind of reaffirming to see that we had been going in a path that was recommended by SBTN, and that also meant that SBTN and the pilot leaders were taking into account the work that had been done in the past and the methods that were used in the past. So I sort of feel like everything was kind of starting to come together in these pilots, and that was good confirmation as we went to announce our new targets this past June.
We had quite a similar experience to what Shannon's describing. General Mills, like I was saying, like Shannon was referencing, has been working on risk assessment for water since 2016, and similar to P&G, we had already had quite a bit of familiarity with the WWF water risk filter and WRI aqueduct as the primary tools that we were using to assess basin impairment. And then we were also already kind of thinking in, I think, what is the spirit of the science-based target, which is to have all users kind of come together with a common vision of a healthy watershed and then take individual actions in order to advance that. So our past watershed approach was really centered around that, around identifying watersheds where General Mills was experiencing business risk as a result of water impairment, and then working towards basin level stewardship plans in those locations. But where we were really lost was, okay, what does General Mills then do in order to help advance this? And I think that is a huge value of where this project helped us start envisioning bridging that gap, where we can continue orienting towards the collective action approach, but also then think about what our fair share and responsibility to address might be within that context.
Great, thank you, Margaret, Shannon, and Samantha for the question. We have some questions in the chat. So it is Derek who is asking whether during the stakeholder engagement phase, if there were any stakeholders, companies or otherwise in the basin decided to undergo the same process. So if one of you would like to answer this question, and I'm just conscious of time. Yeah, Margaret, Shannon.
I don't actually know if anybody else did it in either of our basins during our project. We were working pretty closely with just our consultants and with WWF and didn't have a lot of overlap with other companies during the project, but I understand that a number of other companies were trying this out independently, so maybe it could have been, and that would be a great opportunity for information sharing in the future.
Thank you, Margaret. And I hope that was a good answer for Derek. There is a question around what are the challenges in measuring environmental nature metrics for water, science-based targets, and how are you planning to blend them in the next phase? Any heads up on what to expect?
Cara, before we get into that last question, it looks like Dave put his hand up, and I was going to also add something on the question from Derek.
Yes, sure.
Go ahead, Sam. I was raising my hand to start to answer the next question, but might as well take them in order.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry, I can't see the top of the screen, so I'm not sure what other questions are coming. So on that last question, Derek, I think it would be hard for other companies to be applying the method because we only had a handful of companies that were piloting. But in the future, I think it would be really helpful if we're able to flag up if other folks are working within the same basin so that we can facilitate collaborative action between companies as well as other actors like governments or other stakeholders that might be looking to be setting SBTs. It's something that we've talked about in the past, but we're really at the early stages where we're happy if one actor in a basin is trying to set SBTs. But yeah, ideally in the future, we'll be able to flag that up and create space for folks to work together on SBTs.
So Dave, would you like to add to this, or would you like to answer to the next question?
Well, I'll answer the first half of the next question, and maybe someone could chip in. I can list the challenges in measuring the environmental metrics for water, and then perhaps someone else can weigh in on how we're going to tackle these in the next phase. I think the biggest issue with water is that everything is local. The problem and the solution that you need, you can't do at a global level like you can do for greenhouse gases. Everything is very site specific. As the case studies demonstrated, it's difficult for, especially when you get up in your supply chain, knowing exactly the water use of your suppliers, how much water they're withdrawing or how much nutrient load they are generating. Also, in terms of appropriate thresholds, what are environmental flow requirements, what are appropriate nutrient thresholds, all have to be specified on a local basis. And so that becomes very data intensive. So I think the biggest problem in setting targets is you need a lot of local based data. Companies are generally finding direct operations. They may have it, but going up the supply chain, it gets much more difficult knowing how much water is being used and exactly where, in which basin that water is being used in. How we're going to address this in the next phase, I will punt on that to maybe someone else in the rest of the group, but certainly we've identified that as an issue.
I can jump in here, Hara, if you want.
So no, Michelle, you can answer this. I will just flag that we don't have so much time left. So if folks from the Water and Network Hub can answer some of the questions in the chat, and we can wrap the session up. Let Michelle go ahead and
Yeah, I was just, it's not a panacea to deal with all of the challenges that Dave just laid out, but certainly one of the things that we are hoping to do to facilitate the work by companies and also the collective action within certain basins is to develop some type of database of existing models and tools and thresholds for a subset of basins globally to help ensure that those local models and thresholds where they do exist are as accessible as possible to companies when they're looking to set targets.
Thank you, Michelle. And yes, folks will be answering the chat. So yeah, watch out for the answers. And I'm just conscious of the time, so I'll just ask Michelle to move us to the next slide. So as I've mentioned at the beginning of the session, this September, and specifically in the 15th of September, the Science-Based Targets Network will release the initial corporate science-based targets for nature for public feedback and comments. And the public consultation will last for 4 weeks. So please save the date now and don't miss this opportunity to review these documents and provide your feedback. Next slide, please. Great, thank you, Michelle. So yeah, the exciting news is that companies can get started today on understanding their impacts and dependencies on nature. That is step 1. There is guidance and tools available to do so. And this is a step that all companies will have to complete in order to set a science-based target for nature. And as you can see in the screen, we now have an interactive executive summary of the guidance which can help you get started. Next slide, please. Another action that companies can take right now is to set interim targets. These are available for 5 topics, including water quantity and water withdrawals, and are in line with the best available science and our upcoming methods. Setting interim targets will ensure that your company is on the right path and will count towards science-based targets for nature once available. Next slide, please. And if you're a company, you can join the SPTN Corporate Engagement Program, where we work with companies to test drafts of our methods, our guidance and tools to ensure that what we are creating is as user-friendly and cost-effective for businesses like you as possible. And if you're not a company, but you would still like to join and support us, you can become an SPTN partner. So next slide, please, Michelle. So with that, and before completing the session, I would like you to understand that this is a massive initiative, but it can only reach its full potential if it has the full support of our global community. So let's do this together. We would absolutely love to collaborate with you. And as you saw, there are many ways we can do that. So with that, I would like to thank you all. I would like to reassure you that we will answer the remaining questions, but we will do it after this session. So watch out for the answers to your questions. And yeah, I would like to wish you all a good afternoon and good evening. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.